In the annals of the Catholic Church, there are scholars, there are diplomats, and then there are warriors. Father Gabriele Amorth was undeniably the latter. Before he passed away in 2016, he claimed to have performed over 160,000 exorcisms. To the modern mind, this number seems impossible, a statistical exaggeration, but Amorth was precise in his accounting. He did not mean he liberated 160,000 different individuals, but rather that he engaged in that many individual battles, often fighting for the same soul hundreds of times over years of grueling spiritual trench warfare. For 30 years, as the Vatican's chief exorcist, he operated from a small, unassuming office in Rome, a room that became a battlefield where the oldest war in existence was fought daily, armed only with a purple stole, a crucifix, and the rite of the Roman ritual. But to understand the steel in Father Amorth's spine, one must look further back, long before he put on the cassock. Before he hunted demons, Gabriele Amorth hunted men. Born in Modena in 1925, his youth was forged in the fire of the Second World War. He was not a bystander. He was a soldier in the Italian resistance, a partisan fighting against the fascist regime and the occupying forces that had strangled Europe. As a young man, he learned the smell of gunpowder and the visceral reality of human evil. He saw friends die and enemies kill without remorse. He later received the War Cross for military valor, a testament to his courage under fire. This is the crucial key to understanding his life. He did not enter the priesthood to hide from the world's darkness. He entered it because he had already stared into the abyss of human cruelty and realized that the true enemy was not flesh and blood. When he was ordained in 1954, many assumed he would live a quiet life as a lawyer-priest, given his degree in law, but the discipline of the soldier never left him. He understood that just as an army requires hierarchy, discipline, and weapons to defeat a physical invader, the church required the same to defeat a spiritual one. He often remarked that his time in the resistance taught him that the enemy, whether wearing a uniform or hiding inside a human soul, relies on fear and deception to maintain control. When Cardinal Polelli asked him to assist the official exorcist of Rome in 1986, Amorth didn't hesitate. He recognized the call. He was simply being redeployed from one front line to another, trading his rifle for a rosary, but the nature of the fight remained exactly the same: liberate the captive at any cost. In 1986, the Vatican's Vicar of Rome, Cardinal Ugo Poletti, summoned Amorth for a casual meeting. The conversation was brief, almost bureaucratic. The church was facing a crisis of personnel. The role of the exorcist had largely been abandoned, viewed by many modern bishops as a medieval embarrassment best left in the past. Poletti needed someone to assist the ailing Father Candido Amantini, and he chose Amorth not for his piety, but for his reputation as a man who did not scare easily. Amorth accepted, thinking it would be a temporary assignment, perhaps dealing with the mentally ill or the spiritually confused. He had no idea that he was stepping into a world that most theologians only theorized about from the safety of their libraries. His skepticism evaporated during his first major encounters. In his memoirs, Amorth describes the shock of meeting the enemy face to face. It was not the theatrical screaming often depicted in Hollywood movies that chilled him. It was the impossible physical reality of the phenomenon. He recounts entering rooms where the temperature would plummet instantly, a freezing cold that penetrated the bone even in the height of the Roman summer. He watched as frail, elderly women demonstrated strength that required 4 grown men to restrain, their voices changing into guttural, animalistic growls that spoke in languages they had never learned: Aramaic, Latin, and ancient Greek. This was not mental illness. This was an intelligence, separate and distinct from the person, mocking him, knowing his sins, and recoiling with genuine physical pain at the mere touch of a stole or a drop of holy water. Amorth quickly realized that the devil's greatest victory in the modern age was his camouflage. He saw that the church itself had disarmed, treating the rite of exorcism as a dusty relic rather than a necessary weapon. He wrote about the loneliness of this realization. While his colleagues debated theology in comfortable seminar rooms, he was in the trenches, witnessing saliva turn into glass shards, iron nails being vomited by patients who had never swallowed them, and the undeniable, palpable hatred that emanated from the possessed. He understood then that he was not a doctor curing a sickness. He was a gatekeeper holding back a tide. The enemy was real, ancient, and terrifyingly active, and Amorth knew that from that moment on, there could be no retreat. The casual assignment had become a life sentence. Father Amorth often compared the devil to a chained dog. He can bark and terrify you, but he cannot bite unless you step within the reach of his chain. The terrifying reality Amorth discovered, however, is that modern society has voluntarily shortened the leash. In his thousands of cases, he identified specific open doors that allow evil to gain a legal foothold in a person's life. He was a fierce critic of what the world considers harmless games. He warned incessantly about Ouija boards, seances, and the casual dabbling in the occult. To Amorth, there was no such thing as white magic or good spirits. He taught that any attempt to bypass God to access hidden knowledge or power was a direct invitation to the adversary. He described cases where a simple teenage experiment with a spirit board resulted in decades of spiritual torment, proving that ignorance of the law is no defense in the spiritual court. But perhaps his most important teaching was the distinction between full possession and what he called diabolical vexation or obsession. The movies only show possession, the floating bodies and the spinning heads, which Amorth admitted was incredibly rare. The far more common and insidious tactic of the enemy is vexation. This is not a takeover of the body, but a relentless external attack on the victim's life. Amorth treated countless individuals who suffered from sudden, inexplicable illnesses that doctors could not diagnose, the collapse of businesses, the destruction of marriages, and persistent, crushing, dark thoughts that drove them to the brink of despair. He saw these not just as bad luck, but as a war of attrition designed to wear down the soul until it surrendered. In this context, Amorth framed the church not merely as a place of worship, but as a field hospital for the wounded. The rite of exorcism was the surgery, but confession and prayer were the daily medicine. He was known for his blunt, almost military advice to those suffering from these vexations. Go to Mass, forgive your enemies, stop touching the occult. He stripped away the mystery of the battle. He showed that the devil acts like a legalist, exploiting every grudge, every unconfessed sin, and every dabble in the dark arts to claim territory. The frightening part of Amorth's files is not the monsters, it is the realization of how easily and how often we unlock the door from the inside without even realizing who is standing on the porch. Father Amorth often quoted the French poet Baudelaire, who said, "The devil's finest trick is to persuade you that he does not exist." For Amorth, the modern world was not enlightened, it was blind. He argued that by reducing the devil to a medieval myth or a psychological metaphor, humanity had dismantled its defenses exactly when the enemy was attacking most fiercely. This uncompromising worldview led him into frequent conflict, not just with secular society, but with the church itself. He famously criticized cultural phenomena that others saw as harmless, such as the Harry Potter franchise or the practice of yoga. To the public, he sounded like a reactionary old man, but Amorth defended his position with the logic of a strategist. He believed that anything that desensitized children to the distinction between white and black magic, or any practice that sought spiritual ascension outside of Christ, was a Trojan horse. He wasn't concerned with the exercise or the fiction. He was concerned that they were training wheels for the occult, subtly normalizing the idea that power could be obtained without God. His warnings extended to the highest levels of history and power. Amorth did not shy away from stating that the great dictators of the 20th century, the architect of the Holocaust in Berlin and the Soviet tyrant in Moscow, were likely under diabolical influence. He viewed the industrial scale of the slaughter in the 1940s not merely as political madness, but as a manifestation of pure, concentrated evil that transcended human capability. He saw the devil moving pieces on the geopolitical board, using charismatic leaders to drag millions into the abyss. It was a terrifying perspective that the wars we fight on maps are merely spillover from the wars being fought in the spiritual realm. Perhaps his most frustration, however, lay within the Vatican walls. Amorth was vocal about the smoke of Satan entering the church. He openly criticized bishops and cardinals who had ceased to believe in the literal existence of the devil, calling them faithless shepherds who left their flock unprotected against wolves. He described the agony of conducting exorcisms where the possessed would mock him, revealing the sins and lack of faith of the very clergy meant to protect them. For Amorth, the crisis of the modern church was a crisis of belief in the supernatural. He stood as a lonely sentinel, insisting that if you remove the devil from the gospel, you render the mission of Christ meaningless, for if there is no captor, there is no need for a savior. When Father Gabriele Amorth passed away in September 2016 at the age of 91, he did not leave the church defenseless. Years prior, realizing that the war would outlast him, he had founded the International Association of Exorcists, effectively training a new generation of spiritual soldiers to hold the line. He transformed the role of the exorcist from a solitary, misunderstood figure hiding in the shadows into a recognized, organized battalion within the church hierarchy. He left behind dozens of books and thousands of case files, a tactical manual for future priests to understand the enemy's strategies. In his final interviews, the old partisan displayed no fear of death. He joked that when he finally met the devil in the afterlife, the demon would be the one to tremble, not because of Amorth's power, but because Amorth would be standing behind the Virgin Mary. His ultimate legacy, however, is a message of hope that cuts through the modern culture of fear. Amorth constantly reminded the faithful that while the devil is strong, he is not a god. He is a creature, limited, angry, and ultimately defeated. He taught that the greatest weapon against darkness was not a complex Latin ritual reserved for priests, but the simple daily practice of the rosary and the sacrament of confession. He called confession more powerful than an exorcism, because while an exorcism forces the enemy out, confession removes the enemy's legal right to be there in the first place. As we look at the life of the Vatican's chief exorcist, we see more than just a ghost story. We see a reminder that the world is far deeper and far more dangerous than what we see on the news. Father Amorth stood in the gap between the visible and the invisible, a sentinel who spent 60 years staring into the dark so that others could live in the light. His life poses a challenge to every believer to recognize that the battle is real, to close the doors we have foolishly opened, and to realize that in the end, fear is a choice, but so is faith. And as Amorth proved thousands of times over, when the light steps forward, the shadows have no choice but to flee.